The morning mist hung low over the gardens of Kensington Palace as Catherine, the Princess of Wales, stood at her bedroom window watching the sunrise paint the sky in soft shades of pink and gold. Her reflection showed a woman who had grown into her role with grace, yet today carried the weight of an impossible decision that would change everything for her family. William stirred behind her, his presence both comforting and heartbreaking. They had been awake for hours, talking in hushed whispers about what lay ahead. The children were still sleeping peacefully down the hall, unaware that their parents had spent the entire night wrestling with a choice that no family should ever have to make. The letter had arrived 3 days earlier, delivered by a courier whose solemn expression told them everything they needed to know before they even broke the official seal. The envelope bore the insignia of a humanitarian organization that had been working tirelessly in war-torn regions across the globe. Inside was an urgent plea that would test the very foundations of their commitment to service. Catherine remembered the exact moment. William's face had changed as he read the contents. His jaw had tightened, and she had seen that familiar look in his eyes, the same expression he wore when duty called. But this time it was different. This time, accepting meant leaving behind everything they held most dear. The request was unprecedented. A coalition of international humanitarian groups needed someone with their unique combination of diplomatic influence, public trust, and genuine commitment to peace. The mission would take them to some of the most dangerous places on Earth, where their presence could mean the difference between life and death for thousands of innocent civilians caught in conflicts that had raged for years. What made this request impossible to ignore was its specificity. The organization had spent months researching and concluded that only William and Catherine possessed the particular blend of qualities needed for this mission. Their proven track record in mental health advocacy, their ability to connect with people across cultural divides, and their unshakable moral compass made them the only candidates who could potentially succeed where others had failed, but success would come at an unthinkable price. The mission required complete dedication for an indefinite period. There would be no royal duties, no public appearances, no life as they knew it. Most devastatingly, there would be no contact with their children for their own safety. The nature of the work meant that any connection to their past lives could compromise not only the mission but put their family in danger. Catherine turned from the window as William approached, his arms encircling her from behind. They stood together in silence, both lost in thoughts of George, Charlotte, and Louis. How do you explain to children that their parents must disappear from their lives? Not because they want to, but because other children desperately need their help? The irony was not lost on either of them. They had dedicated their lives to supporting families, to ensuring children had the emotional support and stability they needed to thrive. Now they were being asked to sacrifice their own family stability for the greater good. It felt like being asked to choose between their hearts and their souls. William's voice was barely audible when he spoke. We don't have to do this, Catherine. No one would blame us for saying no. We have our own children to think about first. She leaned back against him, drawing strength from his presence. But we both know we can't say no, don't we? How can we sleep peacefully in our beds knowing that we had the chance to save lives and chose not to? The weight of their privilege had always been something they carried carefully. Born into or married into circumstances that gave them unprecedented platforms for good, they had never taken lightly the responsibility that came with their positions. But this request pushed beyond anything they had ever imagined. Over the past 3 days, they had explored every possible alternative. Could they take the children with them? Absolutely not. The regions they would be working in were far too dangerous. Could they complete the mission in stages, maintaining some contact with home? The organizers had been clear that the success of the mission depended on their complete immersion and commitment. They had consulted with security experts, child psychologists, and trusted advisors. Everyone agreed that if they chose to accept this mission, a clean break would be necessary. The children would need to be told that their parents were going away for work and would return when they could, but there could be no promises about when that might be. The couple had spent hours discussing how this decision aligned with their values and their duties as parents. William struggled particularly with the idea of abandoning his children, even temporarily. His own childhood experiences of loss made the thought of voluntarily separating from George. Charlotte and Louis feel almost cruel, Catherine, drawing on her background in early childhood development, understood the psychological impact their departure could have. Yet she also recognized that their children lived in extraordinary circumstances already, with security details, public scrutiny, and the constant awareness that their parents' work sometimes meant sacrifice. What ultimately tipped the balance was a video call with the field coordinator, a woman named Dr. Sarah Chun, who had been working in refugee camps for over a decade. She had not pleaded or pressured them. Instead, she had simply shared the reality of what she witnessed daily: children who had lost everything, families torn apart by violence, entire communities displaced and desperate. "Your Royal Highnesses," Dr. Chun had said, her voice steady despite the gravity of her words, "I have seen what hope can do in the darkest places. Your presence, your genuine care, your ability to draw international attention to forgotten crises, it could literally mean the difference between life and death for thousands of people." The conversation had lasted 2 hours, during which they learned about the specific regions where they would work, the nature of the conflicts, and the humanitarian crisis that was unfolding largely away from media attention. By the end of the call, both William and Catherine understood that this was not just an opportunity but a moral imperative. Now, as dawn broke over London, they faced the hardest part: telling their children, and beginning the process of saying goodbye to the life they had built together. The next few days would require strength neither of them was sure they possessed. But they knew that stepping away from their comfortable lives was the only choice they could live with. The mission would test everything they believed about duty, sacrifice, and love. But as Catherine looked into William's eyes that morning, she saw the same determination that had first drawn her to him. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, carrying their children's love with them into the unknown. The breakfast table at Adelaide Cottage felt different that morning, though the children couldn't quite identify why. George, at 10, was old enough to sense the undercurrent of tension between his parents, while 8-year-old Charlotte chatted animatedly about her upcoming school project. 5-year-old Louis remained blissfully unaware, focused entirely on arranging his cereal into patterns. Catherine watched her children with an intensity that made her chest ache. She found herself memorizing little details, the way George's hair stuck up at the back, despite her attempts to smooth it down, Charlotte's animated hand gestures as she explained her ideas, Louis's concentrated expression as he worked with his breakfast. These were the moments she would need to hold on to in the months ahead. William caught her eye across the table and gave an almost imperceptible nod. They had agreed that today would be the day they started preparing the children, though neither felt remotely ready for the conversation ahead. The child psychologist they had consulted recommended a gradual approach, beginning with the concept that sometimes parents have to do very important work that takes them far away. After breakfast, they gathered the children in the sitting room. The space that usually buzzed with energy and laughter felt unusually quiet as William and Catherine sat together on the sofa, their 3 children arranged around them. Catherine's hands trembled slightly as she reached for George's hand. "We need to talk to all of you about something very important," William began, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart. "You know how Mummy and Daddy sometimes have to travel for work, to help people in different places?" The children nodded, familiar with the concept of royal duties and charitable work. Charlotte immediately perked up. "Like when you went to see the hospitals in Scotland?" "Yes, like that," Catherine said softly. "But sometimes there are places in the world where people need help very badly and the work is much harder and takes much longer." George's perceptive nature kicked in immediately. "How much longer?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of concern that made both parents' hearts skip. William and Catherine exchanged a look that spoke volumes. They had rehearsed this conversation multiple times, but facing their children's innocent trust made every word feel inadequate. "We don't know yet," William admitted. "It could be many months." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the antique clock on the mantelpiece. Louis, not fully grasping the implications, continued playing with a toy airplane, making soft whooshing sounds. But George and Charlotte understood enough to recognize that something significant was being discussed. "Where would you go?" Charlotte asked, her usual brightness dimming slightly. "To places where there are people who have had to leave their homes because it's not safe anymore," Catherine explained gently. "Children like you who don't have anywhere to live, families who need help finding food and medicine." George, always protective of his younger siblings, moved closer to Louis. "Could we come with you?" The question they had dreaded most hung in the air. William knelt down in front of his eldest son, his voice thick with emotion. "No, George. These places aren't safe for children. You, Charlotte, and Louis need to stay here where you're protected and can keep going to school and seeing your friends." It was Charlotte who asked the question that shattered their hearts. "But who will take care of us?" Catherine pulled her daughter close, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo. "Grandpa Charles, Granny Camilla, Uncle Harry, and Aunt Megan will all be here. And Nanny Maria will stay with you the whole time. You'll be surrounded by people who love you very much." The explanation continued for over an hour, with the children asking innocent questions that cut deeper than any diplomatic inquiry ever could. They wanted to know if their parents would miss them, if they could write letters, if they would be back for Christmas. Each question required careful answers that balanced honesty with age-appropriate hope. What struck both William and Catherine was how differently each child processed the information. George, with his analytical mind, wanted to understand the logistics. "Will you have phones? Can you call us?" Charlotte focused on the emotional aspects. "Will you think about us every day?" Louis, still too young to fully comprehend, simply asked, "Will you bring me a present?" The hardest part was explaining that communication would be very limited and unpredictable. The security requirements of their mission meant that regular contact could put both them and their children at risk. This concept was almost impossible for the children to understand, especially in an age where they were accustomed to instant communication. As the day progressed, the reality began to sink in for the older children. George became quiet and withdrawn, while Charlotte swung between asking excited questions about their adventure and moments of tearful realization about what it meant for her daily life. Both parents noticed how the children began to stick closer to them, as if trying to store up physical affection for the separation ahead. That evening, bedtime routines took on new significance. William spent extra time with George, talking about the responsibilities of being the eldest and how proud they were of his maturity. Catherine lingered in Charlotte's room, braiding her daughter's hair with special care, and promising that they would always find ways to feel close even when far apart. Louis, still operating in his 5-year-old world, accepted the news with the resilience of childhood, more concerned about whether his favorite stuffed elephant would miss his parents too. His innocent acceptance was both heartbreaking and comforting, a reminder of children's remarkable ability to adapt to circumstances beyond their control. The following days became a careful balance of maintaining normalcy while slowly introducing the concept of change. School runs continued as usual, but Catherine found herself savoring every moment of ordinary domestic life. She watched William teach George to tie a more complicated knot, saw him help Charlotte with her mathematics homework, witnessed his patience as Louis insisted on helping with tasks that would have been easier to do alone. They began the delicate process of briefing key family members and staff. The conversations with King Charles were particularly difficult, as he struggled to balance his understanding of their humanitarian calling with his concerns as a grandfather. Queen Camilla proved surprisingly supportive, drawing on her own experience of blended families and understanding the complexities of duty versus personal desires. The security briefings were sobering reminders of what they were undertaking. The regions they would be working in were not just challenging from a humanitarian perspective, but genuinely dangerous. The threat assessments included kidnapping, terrorist attacks, and the constant risk of being caught in active conflict zones. These realities made their decision to leave their children behind not just sensible but essential, yet even as the practical arrangements took shape, both William and Catherine struggled with moments of doubt. In quiet conversations late at night, they questioned whether they were making the right choice. Was their sense of duty overriding their responsibilities as parents? Could someone else really not do this work just as effectively? These doubts were offset by daily reminders of their privilege and platform. News reports about the crises they would be addressing showed the desperate need for intervention. Video calls with Dr. Chun and other field coordinators reinforced that their unique combination of public profile and genuine commitment could open doors that remained closed to others. The children, meanwhile, began to show signs of processing the upcoming change in their own ways. George started asking more detailed questions about world geography and conflict zones, showing an intellectual engagement with his parents' mission that made them both proud and sad. Charlotte became more clingy, wanting extra bedtime stories and more cuddles throughout the day. Louis remained largely unaffected, his world still secure in the immediate presence of his parents and familiar routines. 2 weeks had passed since the initial conversation, and the Wales family had settled into a routine that felt both precious and heartbreaking. Every ordinary moment had become extraordinary in its significance. School pickup conversations, weekend football matches in the garden, and evening story time all carried the weight of being potentially the last for an unknown period. Catherine found herself documenting everything in ways she never had before. She took photos not just of special occasions but of mundane moments, Louis concentrating on his coloring, Charlotte practicing piano, George reading quietly in his favorite corner of the library. She recorded videos of their bedtime routines, their silly jokes, and their arguments over board games. Knowing these sounds of family life would need to sustain her through whatever lay ahead, William threw himself into creating lasting memories with each child individually. He took George on a private tour of RF Northolt, sharing stories of his own military service and helping his son understand the concept of serving something larger than oneself. With Charlotte, he spent an afternoon at the Royal Opera House, watching her eyes light up during a private rehearsal. Knowing her love of music and performance would continue to flourish in their absence. For Louis, the activities were simpler but no less meaningful. William built an elaborate blanket fort in the nursery, creating a secret hideaway where they told stories about brave knights and adventurous princes. He taught his youngest son to whistle, a skill that delighted Louis and created a special connection between father and son. The logistics of their departure were becoming clearer, though each detail felt like another small heartbreak. They would leave on a Thursday morning while the children were at school, avoiding the trauma of direct goodbyes. This decision, recommended by child psychologists, felt both sensible and cruel. The idea of not being able to hold their children one last time went against every parental instinct they possessed. Dr. Sarah Chun arrived for a final briefing, her presence making the mission feel suddenly, startlingly real. She was smaller than they had imagined from their video calls, but her quiet intensity filled the room as she outlined what their first months would look like. The initial deployment would take them to a refugee camp on the Syrian-Turkish border, where over 50,000 displaced people were living in conditions that barely qualified as humane. "Your Royal Highnesses will live among the refugees," Dr. Chun explained, her matter-of-fact tone somehow making the enormity of their commitment even more striking. No special accommodations, no security details that separate you from the people you're trying to help. The moment you step off the transport plane, you become humanitarian workers first and royals second. William asked the practical questions about communication protocols and emergency procedures, while Catherine focused on understanding the specific needs of the families they would be working with. Learning about children who had witnessed unspeakable trauma, who had lost parents, siblings, and homes, reinforced their sense that this mission was not just important but essential. The briefing lasted 4 hours, covering everything from water purification procedures to conflict de-escalation techniques. They would undergo additional training during their first weeks in the field, but the basic requirements were sobering: physical endurance, emotional resilience, and the ability to function effectively in circumstances that bore no resemblance to any life they had ever known. That evening, as they tucked the children into bed, the weight of approaching separation felt almost unbearable. Charlotte had become increasingly clingy over the past few days, often asking when exactly her parents would be leaving and whether they were sure they couldn't take her with them. Her questions showed a sophisticated understanding of the situation that broke Catherine's heart. "Mummy," Charlotte whispered as Catherine adjusted her blankets, "what if something bad happens to you and Daddy when you're helping those people?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything they had decided. Catherine sat on the edge of the bed, choosing her words carefully. "We're going to be very careful, and there will be other people there whose job it is to keep everyone safe. But Charlotte, sometimes grown-ups have to do difficult things because they're the right things to do. Like when you make me eat vegetables even though I don't want to?" Despite everything, Catherine smiled. "Something like that, but much more important. The people we're going to help don't have homes or enough food or safe places for their children to play. We can help them find those things." Charlotte considered this seriously. "Will you tell the children there about us?" "Every day," Catherine promised, her voice thick with emotion. "And we'll think about you every single day, too." George appeared in the doorway, his serious expression showing he had been listening. At 10, he was old enough to understand more than his parents realized, and his questions had become increasingly sophisticated over the past 2 weeks. "Dad," he said quietly, "I know why you have to go. I understand about helping people who need it. But I'm scared about being the oldest while you're away." William knelt down to his son's eye level, recognizing the burden that George was unconsciously taking on. "You don't have to be anything except yourself, George. Grandpa Charles will be here, Uncle Harry, all the adults who love you. Your job is just to be 10 years old." But George's expression showed he didn't quite believe that his responsibilities wouldn't change. As the future heir, he had already begun to internalize concepts of duty and service that most children never had to consider. The idea of his parents leaving on a humanitarian mission made sense to him intellectually. But emotionally, he struggled with feeling abandoned in favor of strangers. The conversation moved to the sitting room, where all 3 children ended up curled around their parents on the large sofa. Louis had fallen asleep against William's chest, while George and Charlotte flanked Catherine. The family stayed like that for over an hour, no one wanting to break the spell of togetherness. Outside, a team of security personnel was conducting final assessments of the arrangements for the children's protection during their parents' absence. Inside the house, other staff members were quietly preparing for a change in routine that would affect everyone in the household. The administrative aspects of royal life would continue. But the heart of this particular family would be absent for an unknown period. Catherine found herself studying William's face as he held their children, seeing the same mixture of determination and grief that she felt. They had made their decision based on principle and moral conviction, but the emotional cost was proving almost overwhelming. The knowledge that thousands of children in refugee camps needed their help was balanced against the immediate needs of their own 3 children. Late that night, after the children were finally settled in their beds, William and Catherine walked through the house they might not see again for months or even years. Every room held memories that suddenly felt precious. The kitchen where they had shared rushed breakfasts between school runs. The study where they had worked on speeches and correspondence. The garden where the children played and where they had found peace during difficult times. In their own bedroom, they faced the practical task of packing for a mission unlike anything either had ever undertaken. The clothes they would need were simple and functional, a stark contrast to the formal attire that usually filled their wardrobes. Catherine packed a small photo of the children, while William chose a simple watch that had belonged to his mother, Connections, to home that would need to sustain them through whatever lay ahead. The final week before their departure passed in a blur of last-minute preparations and increasingly emotional moments with the children. The knowledge that they had just days left created an intensity that made every interaction feel significant. Breakfast conversations, bath time routines, and bedtime stories all carried the weight of being precious and finite. The final Monday arrived with an unseasonable chill that seemed to mirror the heaviness in the house. Catherine woke before dawn, finding William already awake beside her, both of them having barely slept. In 3 days they would be gone, and the weight of that reality had settled over the household. Like a blanket of quiet grief, the children seemed to sense that something was shifting. George had become even more observant, watching his parents with an intensity that spoke of his growing understanding. Charlotte clung more tightly during hugs and asked repeatedly about seemingly trivial details of their departure. Louis remained largely oblivious, but even he seemed to pick up on the emotional undercurrent. Becoming more cuddly and seeking extra attention, Catherine spent the morning in Charlotte's room, helping her daughter organize her bookshelf and talking about the stories they loved to share. As they arranged the volumes of fairy tales and adventure stories, Charlotte asked quietly, "Will you have books where you're going?" "Not many," Catherine admitted. "But I'll remember all our favorite stories, and when I see children who need to hear them, I'll tell them the same stories I used to tell you." Charlotte considered this seriously. "Will you tell them about me?" "Only if they want to hear about a brave, kind princess who loves to read and play piano and makes everyone around her smile." The conversation was interrupted by Louis bursting in with his characteristic energy, announcing that he had built a tower with his blocks that was taller than Daddy. These moments of normal childhood chaos had become even more precious. Reminders of the life William and Catherine would be leaving behind. William spent time with each child individually that day, creating final memories that would need to last. With George, he walked through the gardens of Adelaide Cottage, talking about responsibility and what it meant to be part of a family that served others. "I want you to understand something important," William said as they sat on a bench overlooking the rose garden. "We're not leaving because we want to be away from you. We're leaving because we love you so much that we want to help make the world a better place for you and all children." George nodded solemnly. "I know, Dad, but it still feels like you're choosing them over us." The honesty of his son's words hit William like a physical blow. "George, we could never choose anyone over you, Charlotte, and Louis. This isn't about choosing. This is about using the gifts we've been given to help people who have no one else to help them." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the gardeners tend to the flower beds that would continue blooming long after William and Catherine were gone. George finally spoke again, his voice small but determined. "I'll take care of Charlotte and Louis while you're away." "You'll all take care of each other," William corrected gently. "But remember, you have lots of grown-ups who love you and will be watching over you too." The evening brought one last family dinner at the dining room table, a meal that everyone seemed determined to make special despite the underlying sadness. The children had requested fish and chips, a decidedly unroyal choice that made both parents smile. As they sat together, passing around newspapers wrapped in brown paper and sharing stories about their day, the scene felt both perfectly ordinary and utterly precious. Catherine found herself memorizing the sound of their laughter, the way Charlotte gestured excitedly when telling a story, how George carefully helped Louis with his food, the pure joy on Louis's face when he successfully used his fork to capture a particularly stubborn chip. These were the moments that would need to sustain her through whatever challenges lay ahead. After dinner, they moved to the sitting room for what had become their traditional family game time. Tonight's choice was a simple board game that required no complex strategy, just the pleasure of spending time together. As they played, Catherine and William found themselves letting the children win more often than usual, wanting these final games to be filled with joy rather than competition. Bedtime routines took on ritual significance that evening. William helped Louis brush his teeth, a simple task that had become precious in its ordinariness. Catherine braided Charlotte's hair with special care, knowing it might be months before she could perform this simple act of motherly love again. George, insisting he was too old for elaborate bedtime help, still accepted extra time for reading together, the two of them sharing an adventure story that felt appropriate for their own upcoming journey into the unknown. The house settled into quiet as the children fell asleep. But William and Catherine found themselves unable to rest. They spent the evening hours walking through each room, saying goodbye to the life they had built together. In the nursery, they lingered over toys and books that would remain untouched during their absence. In the children's bedrooms, they watched their sleeping faces, trying to memorize every detail. The next morning brought a flurry of final preparations. Security briefings, last-minute medical checkups, and the heartbreaking task of recording video messages for the children to watch during their absence. Catherine struggled through recording a message for Charlotte's upcoming birthday, trying to maintain composure while knowing she wouldn't be there to celebrate with her daughter. William recorded bedtime stories for Louis, knowing his youngest son would need the comfort of familiar voices during the adjustment period. For George, he created a series of messages about different topics: encouragement for school challenges, pride in his growing maturity, and reminders of their shared interests and jokes. The administrative aspects of their departure required surprising amounts of coordination. Royal duties would be redistributed among other family members. Charity patronages would be temporarily managed by trusted deputies, and the careful machinery of royal life would continue without them. But these practical arrangements felt secondary to the emotional preparation required for leaving their children. Dr. Chun arrived for final coordination, bringing with her a team member who would accompany them on the first leg of their journey. The presence of these humanitarian workers in their family home made the mission feel suddenly, starkly real. These were people who lived and worked in the world William and Catherine were about to enter, where comfort and security were luxuries rather than assumptions. The conversation covered final logistics, communication protocols that prioritized the children's safety over regular contact, emergency procedures that acknowledged the dangerous nature of their work, and the reality that their return timeline would depend on circumstances beyond their control. Every detail reinforced that they were not embarking on an extended royal tour, but on a genuine humanitarian mission with real risks and uncertain outcomes. That evening's dinner was quieter than the night before, with an undercurrent of anticipation that affected even Louis. The children seemed to understand that something significant was approaching, though their understanding varied by age. George asked practical questions about how long the airplane journey would take and whether his parents would be able to see stars in the desert. Charlotte wanted to know if they would meet children her age, and whether those children liked the same games she enjoyed. The final bedtime routine felt almost sacred in its significance. Each kiss goodnight, every whispered, "I love you," carried the weight of being the last for an unknown period. Catherine lingered in each bedroom, watching her children settle into sleep that would be uninterrupted by the knowledge of what morning would bring. Later that night, as they completed their final packing, William and Catherine spoke quietly about their hopes and fears for the mission ahead. They acknowledged their terror at leaving the children, their uncertainty about their ability to function effectively in such challenging circumstances, and their deep conviction that this work aligned with their most fundamental values about service and human dignity. Wednesday evening arrived with a quiet intensity that seemed to permeate every corner of Adelaide Cottage. Tomorrow morning, while George, Charlotte, and Louis were safely occupied with their school routines, William and Catherine would slip away to begin a journey that would take them further from their children than they had ever been, both geographically and emotionally. The decision to leave while the children were at school had been one of the most difficult aspects of their departure planning. Child psychologists had recommended this approach, explaining that prolonged goodbyes could be more traumatic than a clean departure, especially for younger children. But every parental instinct rebelled against the idea of not holding their children one last time. Catherine found herself moving through the house like a ghost, touching familiar objects and trying to imprint final memories. In the kitchen, she ran her hands over the breakfast table where they had shared countless morning meals, arguments about homework and excited chatter about weekend plans. The refrigerator still displayed the children's artwork, their spelling tests, and Charlotte's piano recital schedule, normal family life frozen in time. William spent the evening in his study, finalizing arrangements for the children's care during their absence. King Charles would take on increased involvement in the children's daily lives, while trusted staff members would maintain routines and provide stability. Harry and Meghan had agreed to be available for emergency support, despite their own complex relationship with royal responsibilities. The safety net was comprehensive, but it couldn't replace what the children would be losing. The emotional weight of their impending departure had created an almost surreal atmosphere in the house. Staff members went about their duties with unusual quietness, respecting the gravity of what the family was experiencing. Even the security personnel seemed more subdued, understanding that they were witnessing something unprecedented in modern royal history. As bedtime approached, both William and Catherine felt the precious nature of these final hours with their children. Louis, blissfully unaware that tomorrow would bring change, chattered excitedly about his upcoming show-and-tell presentation at school. His innocent enthusiasm was both heartbreaking and comforting. A reminder of childhood's resilience and adaptability, Charlotte had become increasingly emotional throughout the week, her 8-year-old mind processing the situation with a sophistication that surprised and worried her parents. During her bedtime routine, she clung to Catherine with unusual intensity. "Mummy, what if I forget what you look like while you're away?" Catherine's heart shattered at the question. She sat on Charlotte's bed, pulling her daughter close. "You have photographs of Daddy and me in your room, and I promise you'll remember. But more importantly, you'll feel how much we love you even when we're not here." "How will I feel it?" "Every time you're brave, every time you're kind to someone, every time you help your brothers or make someone smile, you'll be showing the love we've taught you. That's how you'll carry us with you." George, mature beyond his 10 years, approached the situation with characteristic thoughtfulness. He had spent time that evening organizing his room and ensuring his school supplies were prepared for the following day. When William came to say goodnight, George was sitting quietly on his bed, clearly working through complicated emotions. "Dad, I've been thinking about what you said about helping people who have no one else to help them." William sat beside his eldest son, recognizing the serious tone that indicated George was wrestling with concepts far beyond his years. "What about it? I understand why you have to go. I really do. But I want you to know that we need you too, even though we have other people to take care of us." The simple honesty of George's words conveyed everything: his intellectual acceptance of their mission, his emotional struggle with their departure, and his mature recognition that needs could exist simultaneously in different places. William found himself unable to speak for a moment, overwhelmed by pride in his son's wisdom and grief at having to leave him. "George, you're absolutely right. You, Charlotte, and Louis need us, and that's why this decision was so difficult. But sometimes grown-ups have to do hard things because they believe it's right, even when it hurts." They talked quietly for another hour, with George asking thoughtful questions about the refugee camps and the work his parents would be doing. His curiosity showed a genuine interest in understanding their mission, which gave William hope that their children would eventually find pride in what they were attempting to accomplish. The house fell quiet as the children settled into sleep, but William and Catherine found themselves unable to rest. They spent the night hours sitting together in their bedroom, alternating between comfortable silence and quiet conversation about what lay ahead. The weight of their decision felt almost overwhelming in the darkness, when the practical justifications seemed less compelling than the immediate reality of leaving their children. Catherine had written letters for each child to receive on significant dates during their absence: birthdays, Christmas, the start of new school terms. The process of writing these letters had been emotionally devastating, trying to anticipate what each child would need to hear at specific moments while having no idea what their own circumstances would be when those dates arrived. William had recorded video messages for various occasions, but the task had proven almost impossible to complete. How do you comfort a child having a nightmare when you're thousands of miles away? How do you celebrate achievements or provide encouragement during difficulties when you can't even know when those moments will occur? Their final conversations covered practical matters and emotional preparation in equal measure. They discussed their hopes for what they might accomplish, their fears about the dangers they would face, and their trust in the people who would care for their children. Most importantly, they reaffirmed their commitment to each other and to the mission that was taking them away from everything they held dear. As dawn approached on Thursday morning, both William and Catherine moved through their usual routines with heightened awareness. The simple act of making breakfast for their children took on enormous significance, knowing it would be the last time for an unknown period. They prepared George's favorite cereal, packed Charlotte's lunch with extra care, and helped Louis choose his clothes for the day. The children woke up to what appeared to be a completely normal morning. Louis bounced into the kitchen with his characteristic energy. Charlotte needed gentle encouragement to get ready for school, and George moved through his routine with his usual responsibility. Neither William nor Catherine gave any indication that this morning differed from any other. The school run proceeded exactly as it had hundreds of times before. They dropped Louis at his reception class, walked Charlotte to her Year 3 classroom, and saw George settled with his Year 5 friends. The normalcy of these interactions felt both comforting and heartbreaking. Life continuing its familiar patterns even as everything was about to change. As they drove away from the school, both William and Catherine were quiet, processing what they had just done. In a few hours, when the children came home expecting their usual afternoon routine, they would instead find letters explaining that their parents had left for their humanitarian mission. Trusted adults would be there to provide support and comfort. But the fundamental reality was that their family structure had just changed dramatically. The drive to the departure point was silent except for the gentle hum of the engine. Both understood that they had crossed a threshold from which there was no return, at least not until their mission was complete. Behind them lay the comfortable predictability of royal life and family routines. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the hope that their sacrifice would make a meaningful difference in the lives of people who desperately needed help. As they approached their destination, William reached for Catherine's hand, and they held on tightly to each other, facing the unknown together while carrying the love of their children with them into whatever lay ahead. The unmarked transport vehicle arrived at RAF Northolt just as the morning mist was beginning to clear. William and Catherine sat in the back seat, their simple traveling clothes a stark contrast to the formal attire they usually wore for official departures. There were no cameras, no crowd of well-wishers, no ceremonial elements that typically accompanied royal travel. This was a departure shrouded in secrecy, witnessed only by a small group of security personnel and humanitarian coordinators. Dr. Sarah Chun waited beside a modest military aircraft, her weathered face showing the strain of years spent in conflict zones. As William and Catherine approached, she offered a simple nod of acknowledgement, rather than the bows and formalities that usually marked their interactions with officials. From this moment forward, they would be humanitarian workers first. Royals second. The aircraft itself was functional rather than comfortable, equipped for transporting aid workers and supplies rather than dignitaries. As they boarded, both William and Catherine felt the weight of crossing an invisible threshold. Behind them lay everything familiar and safe. Ahead lay a world they had read about, studied, and prepared for, but never truly experienced. Their first destination was Turkey, where they would undergo final training before crossing into Syria to reach the refugee camp that would become their home for the foreseeable future. The flight gave them hours to process what they had just done, leaving their children without goodbye, stepping away from their roles as working royals, and committing to a mission with no guaranteed end date. Catherine spent much of the flight staring out the small window, watching England disappear below the clouds. Somewhere down there, George, Charlotte, and Louis were going through their normal school day, unaware that their parents were already hundreds of miles away. By the time the children arrived home that afternoon, William and Catherine would be in a different world entirely. The letters they had left for the children were carefully crafted to explain their departure in age-appropriate terms. For Louis, the message was simple. Mummy and Daddy had gone to help children who needed them very much, and they would come back as soon as they could. For Charlotte, they had explained more about the refugee crisis and why their particular skills made them uniquely qualified to help. For George, The letter acknowledged his maturity and understanding while reassuring him that his own responsibilities hadn't changed. William found himself reviewing the briefing materials one final time, though he had memorized every detail. The camp they were heading to housed over 50,000 displaced Syrians, including 20,000 children. Basic necessities like clean water, adequate shelter, and medical care were in constant short supply. Their role would be to work alongside established humanitarian organizations, using their unique combination of public profile and genuine commitment to draw international attention to the crisis and coordinate more effective aid distribution. The training period in Turkey proved to be both enlightening and sobering. For 3 intense days, they learned practical skills that bore no resemblance to anything in their previous experience: how to purify water using basic equipment, how to recognize signs of malnutrition in children, how to communicate across language barriers using universal gestures of comfort and care. More challenging was the psychological preparation for what they would witness. Veteran aid workers shared stories that prepared them for the reality of trauma, loss, and resilience they would encounter. Children who had walked hundreds of miles to reach safety. Families separated by conflict with no way of knowing if missing members were alive or dead. Elderly people who had lost everything but maintained dignity and hope against impossible odds. Dr. Chun proved to be both a demanding instructor and a supportive mentor. She pushed William and Catherine beyond their comfort zones while respecting their genuine commitment to the work. "Your Royal Highnesses," she said during one particularly intense training session, "in the camp, titles mean nothing. What matters is your ability to carry water, comfort a frightened child, and maintain hope when everything around you suggests despair." The crossing into Syria was accomplished in darkness, using routes known only to experienced humanitarian workers. As their vehicle navigated rough terrain, both William and Catherine felt the weight of how completely they had left their former lives behind. There was no palace support staff, no security detail, no familiar routines to provide comfort. They were now aid workers in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. Their first sight of the refugee camp was overwhelming. Thousands of makeshift shelters stretched across a barren landscape, housing human beings who had lost everything except their determination to survive. Children played between the tents with toys made from scraps and garbage, their laughter a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Elderly people sat in whatever shade they could find, their eyes holding stories of loss that words could never adequately convey. The accommodation they were assigned was a basic tent, barely large enough for 2 sleeping bags and minimal personal belongings. The contrast with their previous life could not have been more stark. No running water, no electricity, no privacy, no comfort beyond what they could create for themselves. Yet both William and Catherine felt an immediate sense of rightness about being there, a confirmation that they had made the correct choice despite its enormous personal cost. Their first days in the camp were devoted to observation and learning. They worked alongside experienced aid workers, distributing food supplies, helping with basic medical care, and most importantly, simply being present with people who had lost so much. The language barriers that they had worried about proved less significant than expected. Kindness, attention, and genuine care communicated across cultural and linguistic divides. The children in the camp were drawn to them immediately, perhaps sensing their own recent experience as parents. William found himself surrounded by boys who wanted to show him makeshift soccer balls created from bundled rags. Catherine attracted groups of girls who wanted to practice English words and share shy smiles. These interactions, while meaningful, made them both acutely aware of how much they missed their own children. Communication with home was limited and unpredictable, dependent on sporadic satellite connections and security clearances that prioritized safety over convenience. When they were able to make brief calls to Adelaide Cottage, the conversations were precious but heartbreaking. Hearing George, Charlotte, and Louis's voices across thousands of miles, knowing they couldn't provide immediate comfort or presence, tested their emotional endurance daily, yet the work itself proved profoundly meaningful in ways they hadn't anticipated. Their presence did indeed draw international attention to the crisis. News organizations that had previously ignored or minimized the refugee situation suddenly wanted to cover the story. More importantly, their genuine engagement with camp residents created trust that opened doors for other aid organizations. They discovered that their privileged backgrounds, rather than being barriers to effective humanitarian work, provided unique advantages. Their education gave them the analytical skills to understand complex political situations. Their diplomatic experience helped them navigate relationships with local officials and international organizations. Most significantly, their platform as public figures brought resources and attention that translated into tangible improvements for camp residents. Months passed in a blur of exhausting but meaningful work. They helped establish better sanitation systems, coordinated medical supply deliveries, and worked with educators to create schooling opportunities for refugee children. Every small improvement felt like a victory against impossible odds. The personal cost remained enormous. Missing Charlotte's birthday, not being there when Louis lost his first tooth, being absent for George's school performances, these milestones passed without their presence, creating holes in their family story that could never be filled. Yet they also witnessed daily reminders of why their sacrifice mattered. Children who received life-saving medical care because of resources they had helped secure, families reunited through networks they had helped establish, hope sustained in the darkest circumstances through attention they had helped focus on, forgotten crises. As their mission extended beyond their initial projections, both William and Catherine evolved in ways they hadn't expected. They developed physical and emotional resilience they hadn't known they possessed. They learned to find joy in simple accomplishments, and to maintain hope despite witnessing suffering that challenged their fundamental beliefs about human nature and divine justice. The news that they would eventually return home came through the same communication channels that had carried updates about their children's lives. The political situation had stabilized enough to allow for a planned transition of their responsibilities to other workers. After nearly 2 years away from their family, they would be able to go home. The journey back to England felt both endless and too short. They were eager to reunite with their children, but also aware that readjusting to their previous lives would require its own form of courage. They had been changed by their experiences in ways that would affect every aspect of their future, relationships and responsibilities.